afternoon, everyone. Thank you all very much for joining us. Now for the afternoon's proceedings, we are very happy to have with us Dr. Radha Hegde from New York University. Thank you very much for joining us, ma'am. Dr. Radha Hegde is an associate professor at the Department of Media, Culture and Communication at New York University. Her research centers on the subject of globalization, migration, and global media flows. Currently in India on a Fulbright fellowship, she is studying the cultural politics of English in contemporary India as the language of global aspirations today. With a background in English, journalism and communication from University of Delhi and Ohio State, she is currently writing a book titled Mediating Migration, due for release later this year, directly tying into what we hope to be covering in the next 3 days. An activist in the area of gender violence and migration, she is one of the founding members of Manavi, the first feminist South Asian group established in the United States. For the next couple of hours, we have what I expect to be a very, very exciting session. I had the privilege of seeing the slides beforehand. So thank you very much for joining us, ma'am.
So thank you very much, Yashaswini, for the introduction and the invitation to be at this interdisciplinary conference on migration. It gives me great pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I wish to thank the organizing committee, and in particular the student, I guess the student organizing committee and the faculty, in particular Yashaswini Rajeshwar, for all her work in terms of tracking me and connecting with me and arranging this visit. So you are the first to see my slides, and that's totally fine. So once again, thank you. I know my charge was to make this an interactive session. So what I thought I would do is to present, one can try briefly, but I might get carried away, to give you a sort of an overview of my thoughts today, and then perhaps open it up. And in order to facilitate an interaction, I have a fair amount of video clips and so on, which my good friend here, Madhura, will help me orchestrate. So thank you very much. So for the last few years, I have been completely wrapped up in the book project that Yashaswini just mentioned on migration and the materiality of diasporic life, which itself has enveloped over 2/3 of my life spent as an immigrant. So the issues of mobility, migration, and diaspora are of great interest to me. And of course, the terms that Ravi brought up, circulation, biography, and infrastructure. And I think he mentioned Radha might pick up on this. I am actually going to pick up on exactly biography, circulation, and infrastructure, maybe not in that order. So when I was asked to present a topic that might make for interaction, I decided on presenting a work which is very much in formation, a work in progress, titled Diasporic Loyalties and National Anxieties, or whichever comes first. The piece actually came up as a response to a political situation that erupted and escalated last year, transnationally linking the two countries that I straddle, India and the United States. So it is, as I said, a piece that is ongoing, but I'm presenting it so it opens up some questions which I hope to use to stage a discussion about how and where do we begin to narrate the diasporic experience. So given that all of you are from different disciplines, and this is the big challenge for us as speakers, it is interesting, I think, to see how from very different positionalities, from very different intellectual locations, we make sense of how various public events, people and places connect within the dynamics of migration and the rather vexed question about citizenship, belonging, and diaspora. So in this talk, I'm going to, as I said, summon some visuals and video clips to connect reportage, public figures, and events of very recent times. So in September 2014, I'll begin where Ravi ended. Prime Minister Narendra Modi made a dramatic appearance in Madison Square Garden. I'm sure you all heard about this big media blitz. A New York City venue reserved for rock stars and sporting events and holograms and all that, those wonderful things. A large gathering of Indian Americans filled the arena to welcome the Prime Minister on his first state visit to the United States. Mr. Modi received a rousing rock star welcome together with a public display of dual affiliations. You can't quite see it on this, but I'm sure you must have seen it when it happened, and a blended cosmopolitan patriotism. There were flags from both countries, there were music from both countries, so on and so forth. Mr. Modi reached out to the diaspora's pride in the homeland by declaring at that event that this was not only the Asian century, but also the Indian century. But in this fanfare, where several noted US politicians were present, there was a conspicuous absence of another New York celebrity. The US Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara, variously described by the media as the scourge of Wall Street, the sheriff of Wall Street, Preet Bharara, who at that time, not anymore, at that time was being pegged as a possible new Attorney General for the United States. Preet Bharara was not invited to the love fest for Modi. Speaking at a Midtown Manhattan event, Mr. Bharara quipped, "Perhaps the invitation got lost in the mail." This encounter between Mr. Preet Bharara and India captures a rather significant historical moment, and it serves as a provocation to engage and rethink, one, the meaning of long-distance nationalism and the loyalty that is expected of the diaspora to the homeland. Number two, the national affiliations and the cosmopolitan coming of age of the South Asian diaspora in the US. And number three, a dramatic reorganization of what the relationship between the nation and the diaspora means in the context of neoliberal globalization and technological connectivity. Diasporic formations, and I'm sure this is a theme that will evolve over this conference, have historically been constituted with reference to the homeland, and another theme that was brought up earlier, homes left behind, homes remembered, homes reimagined, or homes recreated. Since the traumatic exile of the Jewish dispersion has served as the paradigmatic reference point, the diasporic experience has been most often associated with loss, with alienation, and displacement. The idea of severance and the loss of a homeland has been pivotal in shaping an understanding of the diasporic sensibility and consciousness. Community in the diaspora has always been theorized as arising due to connections forged in the process of negotiating and building deterritorialized cultures. Diasporas always leave a trail of collective memory, writes my colleague Arjun Appadurai. One has to pay due reverence to Arjun when we speak about globalization, about another place and time, and create new maps of desire and attachment. Diasporic cultures are in fact seen as reproductions of home cultures, as attempts to preserve a civilizational notion of cultural purity and authenticity, which kind of explains the common commentary about the fossilized versions of home spaces that are popping up among diasporic communities, whether they be in London, Guyana, Houston, or in New York. However, today, diasporic pathways are both voluntary and not, and are constituted through various social and political particularities. The materialities of migration are fast changing and keeping pace with the shots called by the flow of neoliberal capital, which in turn determines the pathways and the trajectories of migrants and migration itself. This is the moment of the digital diasporas and a redefined nationalism. Communities are increasingly connected to the homeland via technology and remotely influence the political base and infrastructure. This is true of migrants across the board today, whether they are from Mexico, Haiti, China, or Lebanon, or India, of course, a case very clearly shown in the last Indian elections. Some have called this the age of the connected migrant. This description is not merely a description of individual migrants and their digital presence, but rather of the larger political economy of how nations today, in a digital and mediated context, deal with their diasporas and their value as both labor and as investors. The global Indian diasporas, several, including Koshi and Radhakrishnan Wright, have over time supplied a labor pool that has helped mediate the transformation from mercantile to industrial to finance capital. Today, the diaspora is being actively courted by the state, which is dependent on the economic powers of the diaspora. The diaspora have contributed to the shaping of different types of global imaginaries, enabled new types of transnationally positioned and linked communities, and influenced the construction of cosmopolitan public culture. The economic and cultural potential of the Indian diaspora have come to be very influential in the social life of the nation today. Even Koshi argues that non-resident Indians offer a crucial vehicle for reconstructing a globalized Indian identity. You might want to argue about that, but nevertheless. The immigration history of the South Asian presence in the US has traversed a very complex and contested political terrain. It was in the 60s, with the Hart-Celler Act, that there was a flow of professional migrants who entered the country. A journey which was very different from the post-colonial migration that went to Trinidad, Fiji, Mauritius, or even the UK. The diasporic population in North America today has grown much more beyond the original group of skilled migrants and the elite professionals, with much more variations in labor and in the immigration profile of the community. Diasporic politics is, of course, a transnational narrative. It's not a national narrative, and one that is quickly transforming. The non-resident Indian has now become a conduit for capital and is a part of the infrastructure for global functioning and the flagging of a global national identity. For us as scholars, this also highlights a methodological challenge of how and where to study the assemblage of global interconnections, the interconnected web of factors that constitutes the social and the political life of the diaspora. But then let's go back to deconstructing the snub to Preet Bharara. The snub from India to Preet Bharara goes back to the famous, any guess? Devyani Khobragade case, which set off much turbulence, complicating the diplomatic ties between India and the United States. The images are just too precious for me to have passed up. A diplomat, a deputy consul general, of the Indian mission in New York, Ms. Devyani Khobragade, was accused last year of submitting false documents to obtain a work visa for her housekeeper, Sangeeta Richards. Indian officials and the media claimed that the diplomat was arrested, handcuffed, and then strip searched. The media went into high gear, calling the arrest an overt display of American power directed specifically at India and the Indians. The then Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh, called the incident deplorable. Protests erupted in India, making Ms. Khobragade a victim of US state racism. The Indian government retaliated and, as you might remember, even pulled down the barricades protecting the American consular employees in New Delhi. The event proved to be a standoff between the two countries, calling into question nationalism, loyalty to the nation, and even the place of the diaspora, and of course, no doubt, US exceptionalism and US arrogance. According to the law in the US, Ms. Khobragade had indulged in visa fraud. She had taken advantage of a domestic worker, her domestic worker, Ms. Sangeeta Phillips, an issue that has happened in that very same consulate, in that very same city in the past. To Preet Bharara, acting on the case that was first investigated by the US State Department, the case was straightforward. Ms. Khobragade had grossly exploited her domestic worker. Interesting as this case is, I'm not here to discuss, or at least have the time to discuss the ethics of Ms. Khobragade's treatment, but rather the fallout in the discussion and comments made about Mr. Barara. The reports from India were intensely critical of Mr. Barara, calling him the overzealous district attorney. One diplomat went so far as to say Barara was an Indian who was trying to prove himself to be more American than any Indian living or working. A short video clip.
Barara, known as the sheriff on the Wall Street sheriff may be doing a great job at one level. At another level, is there an attempt to specifically target Indians, and is it to appear to be more pious than the Pope, more loyal than the King? That is the question that sources are asking. Whether India takes it up officially with the United States of America or not remains to be seen. But the pattern that you and I were talking about just a short while back, going after Indian diplomats, going after Indian diplomats' children, parking fines for Indian diplomats, body searching them, frisking them at airports. Now these are courtesies that are extended to diplomats across the world. They are reciprocal. India has extended a large number of other courtesies which are unilateral. But in New York specifically, Indians are being targeted and Indian diplomats are being targeted. Preet Barara, known as the sheriff on the Wall Street.
Sheriff on the Wall Street is a very different and I think highly exaggerated script about the Wild West was being circulated in the Indian media, with a relentless Indian American sheriff hunting the real Indians. As you heard, Mr. Barara morphed into a character more pious than the Pope, and more curiously as being more loyal than the King, and then later as an Uncle Tom, a man so prone to self-loathing that he wanted to disassociate himself from his own community.
I don't say anything about him. I don't recognize him. Why should I recognize somebody who doesn't belong to my jurisdiction?
This is Preet Barara, the man who called India a liar. He is the Indian origin attorney for New York who has accused diplomat Devyani of committing visa fraud.
I don't say anything about him. I don't recognize.
To Mr. Salman Khurshid, the then External Affairs Minister, Barara and his office was completely irrelevant. And yes, Preet Barara is naturally not of Mr. Khurshid's jurisdiction, being the District Attorney of the Southern District of New York in the United States. Clearly, Mr. Khurshid's logic rested on the identity politics of who Mr. Barara represented, evoking the larger question of who is an Indian American, and circumscribing the role and that an Indian American can possibly play. As an activist in New York mentioned, Mr. Khurshid's question, who is Preet Barara, is a vilification of Mr. Barara, and Mr. Khurshid of all people, this activist, Ms. Bhattacharya noted, should know who the investigator of this very important national case is. Social media, of course, had a field day. Yeah, thanks. That's it. Had a field day evoking race and complicating it with the global power of whiteness and the local and a very local discourse of fairness. So I'm just trying to show you how this one incident kind of gets carried away into multiple domains. What does it mean to call a naturalized American citizen of trying to act more American? Are the Indians in their critique not granting the diaspora the right to claim their identity as Americans because of their origins, because of their race? Take a listen to what Preet Barara himself said at a commencement address he gave at Harvard a few months after the incident. A very, very short clip.
So you may have heard, some of you, about a case we brought last year in which the State Department arrested a mid-level Indian diplomat, female, Devyani Khobragade, for visa fraud in connection with lies about she would ultimately pay her domestic worker. Not the crime of the century, but a serious crime nonetheless. That's why the State Department opened the case. That's why the State Department investigated it. That's why the career agents in the State Department asked career prosecutors in my office to approve criminal charges. So that case basically caused an international incident. Now, putting aside disputes about the merits of the case, somehow the Indian government and the Indian press decided that the case was brought by me, an Indian American, for all manner of bad personal reasons. Never mind that the case was initiated and investigated by career law enforcement officials, and that I became personally aware of it only a day or two before the arrest had been scheduled. talk show hosts in India took to calling me a self-loathing Indian who made it a point to go after people from the country of his birth, which was a bit odd since the alleged victim was also Indian. An Indian official basically asked on television, "Who the hell is Preet Bharara?"
He didn't say hell.
And the criticism got increasingly intense over time, which might not have bothered me so much, except that it bothered my parents, who came from India to this country as adults. And that was tough because it bothered them. And then it bothered me again when I had to explain to my daughter, who overheard a conversation in the house, of what it meant to be called an Uncle Tom, because that's what I was being called by journalists in South Asia.
As Mr. Bharara mentions later in his address, Indian critics were angry because even though, I'm quoting him, I hailed from India, I appeared to be going out of my way to be acting American and serve the interests of America, which was odd because I am an American and the words US are in my official title. Now, this is an argument about when and how the diaspora shift allegiance and loyalty. It is an interesting revisiting from the homeland of the assimilationist narrative that the West has traditionally used to discipline immigrants, classifying the assimilable and the unassimilable other. I mean, in an age of Islamophobia, one has heard a great deal about the unassimilable immigrants. Mr. Bharara had also clearly advanced in this clip that you saw his own generational narrative of assimilation. His parents were troubled having come from India as adults, implying their firm emplacement within a dual structure of national identification versus his own having come to the United States as a young boy. Then he raises the image of his own children being raised in a post-racial context, at least he implies that, where he as a parent is now forced to tell them about the meaning of Uncle Tom. So from the Indian side, the diaspora are still not perceived as fully Indian, but at the same time, certainly not completely of the United States either. They are expected to remain loyal to the country of their birth, but from this standpoint, Bharara then becomes a traitor on a conspiratorial mission. Preet Bharara is in the minds of India because of his racial background, does not represent the legal face of the United States, but rather occupies the liminal position of being ever different and performing racial subservience to his masters, who ironically happen to be both black, both Obama and Eric Holder. The complicated perception of actors in this case reinforces a rather monolithic understanding of nationalism and race that is indeed at odds from the way in which citizenship is perceived and performed in the everyday. The politics of balancing affiliation, languages, histories is a fluid part of diasporic life, and quite unlike the dualistic cultural exchange model that the media and Indian politicians seem to evoke. What the case ironically reveals is that in all their diversity of socioeconomic status, geographical spread, and occupations, the South Asian diaspora has perhaps come of age in the US society. This coming of age is a multi-layered, complex global narrative. Take Preet Bharara, for instance, incredibly successful son of Indian American parents who migrated as skilled professionals. I'm just using his own story. They migrated, of course, to England and then arrived in the 70s to the United States. A classic story of post-colonial serial migration, and one that mirrors the opening up of the US for professional migrants from Asia, particularly in India. The generation that has now permeated the fabric of the US. As a child of this generation, Mr. Bharara is considered a second generation Indian American, highly accomplished, Ivy educated Indian American who has made it. On every cover of magazine and newspaper, Mr. Bharara has appeared, termed the Sheriff of Wall Street, the celebrity DA whose name rings fear in Wall Street, having put away powerful financial crooks of Lower Manhattan. He has to date arrested 76 criminals, but the one that brought him all the criticism is Devyani Khobragade, who represents India in her mid-level consular position. Mr. Bharara has charged Russian diplomats, I'm just reading his CV here, with medical fraud, has been banned from entering Russia by Vladimir Putin. He has taken on the Al-Qaeda, the Italian crime family, the Gambinos, many others. But then again, it was the Khobragade case that defined him as the vengeful Indian. But according to Preet Bharara, in the words of his own favorite Hollywood film, The Departed, I'm just the guy who does his job. You must be the other guy. He was simply the guy who was doing his job, is what he claims. His job included, among others, a staggering lineup of South Asians who have all been arrested and serving time under Preet's watch. Raj Rajaratnam, of course Sri Lankan, of the Galleon Fund, accused of insider trading. Dinesh D'Souza in that lineup, ultra-conservative, who made bogus campaign contributions for a right-wing candidate, serving time again. Rajat Gupta, number 3, of the former worldwide head of McKinsey, also accused of insider trading. My spell check picked up all the trading as tradition, so you know which world I walk in. Matthew Martoma, portfolio manager for SAC Capital Advisors, the last of this set, also in prison. It is this South Asian lineup from the boardrooms of Wall Street that is used to bolster the argument that Preet Bharara is out to nab Indian Americans. The case opens up all kinds of questions. Don't get me wrong, I'm not an advocate for Preet Bharara, but I think it opens up all kinds of interrelated questions about diaspora, a few of which I will summarize. First, this explanation of personal motives, of a binary identification. You are either Indian or you are American, bypasses the larger historical narrative of this conjuncture that defines diasporic politics and identification. The argument about Preet Bharara being a self-loathing Indian denies the diaspora the complexity of affiliation that defines their very positionality. It uses a mere racial identification as the basis for national loyalty, which is exactly what the diaspora has been opposing in their politics and in the multicultural spectrum of the United States, or in any other country for that matter. The criticism from India about Preet being an Uncle Tom reveals the circulatory reach of the racial definition of what it means to be an American. In fact, somebody, when I last gave this talk, asked me a question about, but how is Richard Verma the new ambassador? But we'll unpack that later. You must have seen the Indian American who is now the new ambassador during Obama's visit. So denies the complexity and uses a racial identification as a basis for national loyalty, which is exactly what we are trying to pose. That Preet is an Uncle Tom reveals the circulatory reach of the racial definition of what it means to be an American. It actually reinforces and recoups whiteness as the hegemonic marker of what it means to be an American. When the criticism about Preet Bharara evokes is also a simplistic model of enduring loyalty, which refuses to recognize or chooses to selectively understand the presence and politics of the diaspora in all its occupational and generational diversity. The details of each of these lives and crimes shown here is a high visibility drama involving Wharton, Stanford, hedge funds, Swiss accounts, McKinsey, philanthropy, insider trading, all sex, all kinds of sleazy details. I know you're wondering what, but I don't have time to get into that. All kinds of sleazy details that go into white-collar crime on Wall Street. In some ways, maybe we could say that the South Asian diaspora has indeed come of age, in the sense of the spectacular visibility across the board. Of course, I play on the word board. We have seen professors, and from the 60s, this was the trajectory. It was you remember the day of the brain drain. It was, in fact, the US saw skilled professionals. So we've seen professors, doctors, scientists, Nobel laureates, cooks, and then in that order, cooks, musicians, taxi drivers, computer startup stories on Silicon Valley, business tycoons, and now the sheriff and the thieves of Wall Street. Perhaps in the neoliberal equation, it is ironically this trading in the very belly of the economic beast, which is the ultimate art of being the insider. It is exactly these South Asian Americans, the successful economic migrants, who play a very significant role in the construction of India's global image, and perhaps the reason for the love fest that I started with. They are being actively courted by the Indian state. So we circle back from the diaspora to the homeland, not yet, and Mr. Modi's blockbuster events for the diaspora, and of course the infamous snub. Mr. Modi was reaching out to a largely professional middle-class diasporic base in the US who have already got strong cultural, political, financial ties with India. It was a clear and direct appeal to the economic power and the investment potential of the Indian American diaspora. Mr. Modi's speech was a definitive turning point in the relationship between the diaspora and the nation, by which I mean the homeland. Mr. Modi was not urging the diaspora to return. That was a discourse of an older time. But rather he was leveraging their cosmopolitan status as global Indians. The social media publicity and this rousing media blitz was a definitive moment that changed the discourse of national expectations with regard to the diaspora. Here was a nationalist prime minister, essentially ending the guilt trip to return home. You know, the nostalgia that we so often associate with immigrants. You know, he kind of ended that with one stroke. Here is an example of a nation state encouraging flexible diasporic affiliations that are valuable in securing its own, in this case India's, global image. As privileged global citizens, the diaspora is celebrated as integrally connected rather than removed from the homeland, and now as promoted as a global brand. The rhetoric, once again, completely propped up by a media apparatus, reinscribes the diaspora within the nation in a revised form of long-distance nationalism, something I started with. So for this economic flexibility to work, the expectation is also intact that Mother India has to be the eternal lodestar for the diaspora. I use this eruptive incident as an argument that the diaspora is increasingly becoming part of the branding of global India, and with it comes expectations of nationalism, affiliation, and when affiliation runs counter, I'm sorry, I missed something, and national affiliation. And when it runs counter, and oftentimes this affiliation that's expected runs counter to the multiplicity that itself defines the condition of the diaspora. The relationship between the nation and the NRI, I'm using the state coined term, and I use that intentionally now, is being forged in strategic ways under the conditions of the neoliberal global economy. The accomplishments of the South Asian community and their economic successes are a coup for India as it recruits the diaspora to participate as long-distance members of the nation. But when affective and administrative currents from the diaspora run counter to the homeland, anxieties about the betrayal of the diaspora run high. Why are these loyalties now being demanded as obligatory of the diaspora to the homeland and being rebuked so intensely? While there is a politicization of the links between the diaspora and the homeland, other issues which are not part of the sovereign agenda of the nation are completely sidestepped and pushed out of the priority list. In the nationalist clamor over Devyani Khobragade, the political issues about gender, labor, and the minimum wages of domestics was evicted. I mean, these are the narratives of eviction that, to use Saskia Sassen's words. The state reaches out to the Indian diplomat, but fails to recognize both the investigator and the accused, who, by the way, was paid $3.31 an hour instead of the promised $9.75 an hour. Ananya Bhattacharya, who was interviewed on NDTV, an activist in New York, calls this a misplaced patriotism and highlights the fact that the oppression of domestic labor was not even raised. In an interesting twist, There was one talk show on NDTV where the headlines wondered if by raising this issue about domestic labor, the journalist query kind of quipped, was Preet Bharara being more Indian than an Indian? So that was the next twist. The question of minimum wages and the plight of domestic workers is a transnational issue that stretches within the diaspora and the diplomatic community from the United States to the Emirates and other places. Although I think very recently I did read that the government of India has placed severe restrictions on domestic workers who can accompany diplomatic personnel. I'm sure you're aware that most diplomatic personnel who leave, go to other countries from India, take with them a retinue of staff, domestic staff. There was indeed a protest from women's groups in New York, a small one, a muted one, but nevertheless, right outside the the Indian consulate office. There was in fact the group that I work with, Manavi, was protesting, but what was interesting was also unions of immigrant workers from area hotels were also protesting. As I said again, small, never registered in the Indian press, but existed nevertheless. I could not resist this final twist. I'm almost done. Miss Khobragade, in a very, of course she has, I haven't, has once again surfaced in the media. Some of you might be aware. And in her recent conversations to the media, she has been framing the whole event by reinserting, and this I think is a conversation for a whole entire paper, her role as a mother. So a mother abandoned by the women that she installed as a mother in her place to serve the nation, to serve the motherland. So it's a very interesting play on the mother abandoned by the mother installed for the motherland. Thereby fusing the trope of motherland and the artful cunning of those who want to get a green card through nefarious means. You have to take a listen to this.
Many people ask me, are you angry with your housekeeper? And I tell them that, I sort of understand what she did, because if in New York and DC and all these places, there is a racket which goes on of all the immigration lawyers and NGOs who actually go and ask people, do you have somebody to accuse? And, they will get you a green card, a permanent residency. I understand how tempting it may have been for her. And I have worked out all the anger. I felt more anger because of the pain that I went through. I felt abandoned when she ran away, so I can imagine how my children felt. My primary concern was that they shouldn't feel abandoned. They kept asking, where's Sangeeta Tai, and I had to tell them, she was gone for her summer vacation, and she'll come back in winter, and hoping that they'll forget about her till winter. Many people are.
The case and the moment forces a revision of the model of diaspora and the homeland, which has moved historically from complete removal from the nation and a cutting of ties, to attempting to stay connected, and now to this moment of complete participation and involvement. So we've moved against the terrain of, rupture, attachment to participation, both economic, political, and social. A participation that is enabled, orchestrated, and regulated very strategically by the state. It should be noted here that the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas was organized symbolically around the day of Gandhi's return to the motherland, very recently, last month, where the discourse is worth telling. Madras. While Mr. Modi urged the diaspora to participate in highways and highways, the External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj urged young non-resident Indians that the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas is about discovering your roots by learning about and appreciating your heritage. And in a nutshell, the minister added, it's all about the 3 C's: connect, celebrate, and contribute. Connect with the motherland, celebrate her civilizational heritage, and don't forget to contribute. It's an occasion to reflect upon your heritage, she said, and to touch base with a country which will always regard you as one of its own, regardless of the color of your passport, regardless of the land of your citizenship. Now me. To what extent that is true is something that one can discuss in this interactive session. Mr. Modi, after all, did not begin his international blitz in Mauritius or in the camps of Abu Dhabi or even Washington, D.C., but he began it in the financial capital of New York City. It was also tailed by the vibrant Gujarat summit. And media reports say that there was a blurring. In fact, there was an article on the front page of the Hindu that one is not quite sure if the Gujarat summit and the PBD are two separate events or not. There was an intentional blurring. The PBD was organized to synchronize with the centenary of Mahatma Gandhi's return to India, while cashing in on the trope of the father of the nation and Khadi was symbolic and made for good Khadi tourism. The intention was not to persuade or guilt-trip the diaspora about staying away. In the new neoliberal climate, with all the powerful reach of media and new technologies, the nation would rather see its diaspora away on global shores, but enabled to invest locally. However, new types of liminalities and new politics of loyalty and affiliation are simultaneously being created within the diaspora, and sometimes problematically for the nation. The invitation to Preet Bharara that I started with was clearly not lost in the mail. Meanwhile, our man is on the roll. This is from last week. Thank you very much. I might have inundated you with a few images and clips, but I could not resist. I think it, and I did not intentionally unpack the classic clip from Ms. Khobrodare, because I did want to finish in less time than I took. But I'd be happy to take some questions and open it up for some discussion. Thanks so much.
The clips were fantastic. I'm so glad it was like a show. That was great fun. And I would like to sort of talk about the awful COVID election, right? In so many ways. And I'm putting it out there on that new class. Yes. And to speak a little bit about this particular case and its relation to how gender becomes very particular to how Khobrodare is both contested and protected in the same fashion, both infantilized as well as deified, while the other woman gets lost. The kind of intersectionality of class and gender, if you could just open it up.
Answer your own question. Yeah, absolutely. I didn't bring up that part of it because I wanted to stick to Preet and his story and what it opens up. Absolutely. I mean, that final twist where one gender is erased, right? So, I mean, not erased, but made hyper-visible in a particular classed way. But it was also interesting that she also called herself, others called her, said she's a Dalit and she's oppressed and so on and so forth. So there was that layering also of caste, of class, and then nothing about Sangeeta Richards, and that the idea of a domestic worker. In fact, Arnab Goswami, I wanted had another precious comment where he says, did anybody watch that? It's been a while. But he says, seriously, she's an Indian diplomat. She's only paid, I can't remember the details, but it's like $4,100 a month. And how do you expect her to pay at that rate $4,900 to a domestic? The idea that she doesn't need a domestic, that never even arises. So that's one. The other is that it's an easy assumption that there are NGOs working, who are waiting there to say anybody who defaulted or something that you want to nab. So that sort of thing. But what it was interesting that the labor issue of domestics has been so frequently an issue with the Indian diplomats. The very last one, of course, the last Consul General had the same problem. Then there was another diplomatic, somebody, some years ago, I remember some 10 years ago, they had this amazing estate in Long Island and they had a woman who was walking inside. So this is a serious issue, but it's also interesting how it layers onto motherland. You know, and I think her saying that I'm being abandoned is this again a global story of domestic help. As we know, there's much work that's done on Filipino women, for example, who outsource their mothering to somebody, and they mother and so on. So the woman and the lawyer in Rome who has a Filipino nanny has in turn outsourced mothering. Right? So it is a very complex story of labor, class, gender, intersectionality, as you put it, layered with the play on the mother and the mother. So I have outsourced my mothering. She abandoned me. That's remarkable. I didn't say anything about her. Your professor. Yes.
No, Radha, I think to add to what she just said, the caste issue.
Yes.
I mean, which you didn't bring up
Yes.
explicitly, but Copacabana is supposedly Dalit.
Yes.
And so that is something you don't want to, highlight, because when, a Dalit woman has actually oppressed, and I don't know what Sangeeta Richards' caste is, but if in that kind of a hierarchy, so it becomes a a much larger complexity, and I don't think the media is courageous enough to talk about Copacabana's background, because she's obviously not first generation Dalit, but she is second or third generation, and then what happens to that? So in one sense, there is a very interesting comparison between Preet Bharara and Copacabana. Copacabana's aspirations are what Preet Bharara's children are. So in that sense, I think as a person, I myself am interested in the intersectionality of not just all class, gender, but also generation and gender in the diaspora.
Yes.
I think in one sense, Copacabana has been caught in the middle, of all this, and her own situation back home probably did not give her the wherewithal to be able to deal with things in an American way, So I think that complexity is
just excellent. I thought of the generational thing when Pete talks about.
He talks about
my parents who they're already of two words, but me, I was kind of that way. But the children, I understand that's also kind of problematic that he seems to say that they're in a post-racial Obama world. But it's amazing what you just said. And to add to it, the caste issue is, I think, exploded, but it's really there. They do not bring it up because she's unmarked because she's made it. She has made it. And the new twist is that, I'm sure you must know, she's married to an Indian American.
Yes.
And her children have US passports, which evidently is against the law for a diplomat to have children who have foreign passports. So that again is another generational complexity of who's allowed to be what under what circumstances. Thanks.
Those things will change.
Yes.
Every time, from the NR, and we talking about that in the morning as well, but the PIO to the NRI to the OCI, now I'm sure those things will become conflicts there.
That was another thing that Mr. Modi said in both Australia and the US, that don't worry about the visa, just come.
Exactly.
And you can get it to the
I believe
airport.
Americans are the most quoted. Not just quoted, they're the ones walking in without a visa. I was just reading the paper.
Oh, I see.
On arrival.
So when she says, when Sushma says, irrespective of, it's not the color of your skin, it's the color of your passport. You are the child of the mother. That's so not true. Of course, the color of the passport matters.
I want to go back to your point of national anxiety. But I was wondering if you had, if you thought it useful to use the category of the post-colonial angst that it's about the diaspora, which you are very proud of seeing naked
As a brand.
Yes. And
in the sense, also therefore, by the diasporic community kept at a distance when they want to assimilate, but also reclaimed by the diasporic community when they want to showcase that they are not integrated sufficiently. Right? And it works both ways, in the homeland and in the diasporic location. And also the fact that
the strategic use of affiliation, which is
and so much vitriol against Preet Bharara because he seemed to have made that transition and said very clearly and unambiguously that I am American. That I don't subscribe to this. I am American. And the other earlier, for example, one doesn't maybe also the distinction in those cases didn't happen the day of the kind of 24/7 media we have these days. And the prosecutor was not Indian American.
in the previous, yes.
Those were diplomatic issues. Those were one can recall that the Indian government specifically raising the issue of domestic wages in the United States. That minimum wage is lower in the United States. Why don't you engage with that? Let's engage with this whole thing, etc. The fact that people Mexicans are employed without any guarantees, etc. But in this particular case, it's only and only nationality that gets highlighted.
Race and nationality. Then it's something else. In the previous case, it was the ambiguity is a wonderful way in which to place it.
And the fact that in this time, when the US claimed exceptionalism, as a matter of course, which they do as a matter of course in their foreign policy, they don't want a negotiation with that. Okay, the Americans are not at all apologetic about the fact that they take an exceptional position because they justify it historically. So when they made that exceptional argument, it was not accepted so easily. Here, it was not accepted so easily. So, for example, one of the things that the Indian government did was to open, call for records of how much the teachers in the American school and the American embassy are being paid. And to also say that we will not give a liquor license to the club that runs on the premises.
They took it away.
Yes. And of course the thing that you mentioned, which of course was right.
I know the slippage here is so easy to say that no, they should have done this, but because I'm not at all discounting the fact of American arrogance. That is not the point. The way in which certain things get selectively highlighted.
That nationality just completely overshadowed all other aspects of what could have been a straightforward diplomatic, unpleasant but straightforward diplomatic negotiation.
And also the power bit, when he says, I didn't show you the rest of Khrushchev's clip, when he says, who is he? I'll deal with him. I will not deal with some guy. He becomes a son. So once again, it is between two states, but however that doesn't happen. And then the violent exaggeration, by the way, that you saw in that media clip of they're out to get party tickets, they're seizing Indian children, they're nabbing I tried to research this whole thing about tickets and so on. I really couldn't come across anything. Maybe it was Miss Kobragari's father has been very vocal also in this. So thanks for that amazing comment. Thank you.
I have a question about a slightly related one on the Hindu identity in the US. Because the Modi's speech and the kind of spectacular show also had a very specific this identity. So why did you comment on that? What kind of identity do they aspire for? How do they look at Modi?
Once again, an extremely complicated question, right? Because the Gujarati diaspora is very big. Also, part of the diasporic reality, as I'm sure will unfold this conference, is this search for authenticity. So when people say visitors from India come to Queens, for example, and say, oh my God, this is like Bombay, why are we here? So that sort of comment registers a much more complex reality of the search for authenticity. And in that search for authenticity, the religious piece becomes very important, which is all about Aparna's research, religious identity in the diaspora. becomes a significant part. And so I think Modi and these sort of comments that the motherland will welcome you plays right into that. Now, of course, the numbers, you have to take the conservatism of the Indian American and their political affiliations there and their sort of where they come from here. So it plays right into that sort of presentation. Yes.
That comment, it just got over my head, out to get South Asian Americans, who said that? Anyway, it just
I didn't say.
South Asian Americans. It was as
This is Indian Americans. But anyway.
Indian Americans, whatever. So that kind of racial profiling, that all these big heavyweights or Asian heavyweights in the business, they're being that, it's somehow like kind of, in my head, how black African Americans, they were all targeted as criminals, So if you're like black, automatically the white police is going to target you or point you, or maybe you are a criminal, So, I mean, is there any connection? I mean, I have no idea. It's just a very far connection came to my head. These are all heavyweight Asians.
But that's, you're talking about that Mark and Rajaratnam and so on?
Yeah.
There is a whole, I don't want to get into that. There's this idea, the Indian media plays into that somehow Indian Americans are out to nab other Indian Americans. So it's a kind of an interesting thing. Or they're trying to be so obsequious to their white master. So which is what Preet says, Obama's my master, so what are they talking about? So that sort of thing. But, the four guys that I showed there, there's also a discourse in India, if you look at the economic and financial reporting, that there have been other groups who have done worse things. So why pick on Rajaratnam? Why pick on Rajat Gupta? So that has also been there. So, they are our success stories. If you look at each of them, Rajat Gupta headed the world something for AIDS. Rajaratnam was major, now there's something about the Tamil Tigers and one has surfaced, but his name was always about philanthropy. D'Souza was a favorite darling of the ultra-conservative right. So each of them have had another life outside the sleeves. So that was very big in the Indian press and in the Indian diasporic press, in social media. That, had they been white, hasn't there been, and they would name all these other New York Wall Street criminals. This probably would not have happened. So if it's the racial conjecture, would it have happened? Thanks to that. Yes.
Just leading on some question, which is that it's a very basic question that I just need an answer to. How justified is this superimposed homogeneity on the Indian diaspora, let alone the South Asian diaspora? Like he said, just not just the Hindu identity, but also the linguistic identity. Modi went there, spoke in Hindi. What happened to the several other languages that were represented, and how justified is dealing with the entire Indian diaspora as one language or one community, given the way we celebrate diversity back home? How justified is that?
It was, it was first of all not a free event. It was a ticketed event. And the tickets, you could get the tickets in that Swaminarayan temples. That goes back. So you could either go first come first serve to the Swaminarayan temples, or you had to buy it. And I think it was pretty steep to buy it. So it was quite selective. It's huge gathering, and I think the man who ran it was an Indian American physician who was a childhood friend of Narendra Modi's. There's a lot of them. So absolutely, I think it was very much a Gujarati diaspora-driven event. But needless to say, I remember when the elections happened, every single Patel brothers, they were giving out free ladoos and free this and free that, So, while it is, in fact, in the numbers bear out in terms of the demographics of the diaspora, I think there is, in fact, a great deal of support in the diaspora for but it was a very Hindi speaking event, no doubt. Yes, please.
Ma'am, keeping Preet Bharara in mind,
yes.
How do you look at somebody like Bobby Jindal, who has made it very clear that he's not an Indian American, but he talks about becoming an American. Again, he's probably talking about the identities, new identities, as in becoming. But then he's probably reinforcing the same ideological drive towards American.
Yeah.
So how do you see it? What about history? He's saying that he's not shy about his Indian origins, but then again, he has become an
used to be killed, you all know that, right? So he's himself morphed by himself in various ways in order to fit into the assimilationist narrative. I believe he also converted, yeah, I think I read that too. So I think it's many, I presented this talk in Hyderabad and I had the same question, how do you kind of fit Nikki Haley and Bobby Jindal into this narrative. In a sense, it's similar from the other side. It's also a very simplistic way of saying, I'm no longer Indian, I'm American. So this sort of exchange model, which is exactly what immigrant groups have been working against. You don't just become a salad bowl or a ridiculous metaphor, right? That you become, it's not a melting pot and so on and so forth. It's a very simplistic way to understand it. And he's in a sense reclaiming that for his own political ends, to show in a very hastened way, to speed up the fact that I am in fact unhyphenated. I am all of the melting pot and I am already there. So problematic. From my politics and from where I stand, but it's turning out to be very advantageous for him politically. By which I'm saying, the assimilationist narrative has been what the West everywhere in most countries use. I mean, I think it is used in our home in terms of immigrant migrants, right? This need that you need to assimilate, who can assimilate, and somehow the assimilated one becomes the superior type of immigrant.
Yeah. What about mixed race people? It is even more complicated. Mixed race,
Yeah. Yes.
My question is kind of connected to what Professor asked. This is related more to the consequent discourse which emerged out of the incident of Devyani in Khobragade. As she said, the idea of nationality, the identity of nationality kind of overwhelmed all the other identities which, like gender, which should have been taken into consideration. But I would like to refer to Amartya Sen's idea of multiple identities, which he covered in his book, Identity and Violence. How he said that every identity emerges in a particular context. Every identity is context specific. So how do we understand the larger context in which the identity of nationality overwhelms the other kind of identity? How do we understand the emergence of the discourse, one particular discourse rather than another? How do we understand this whole trend?
I think that this case was a provocation to think about exactly that. Moments of high visibility sensationalism when nationalism gets involved. Other than that, I don't know.
Can we also
No, go ahead.
Can you also look at it from a very diplomatic perspective, where India, looking at India's current rise in the diplomatic scenario, seeking a
global confirmation, affirmation,
including a seat in the permanent seat in the Security Council, to reassert its own identity as a nation. Can you also kind of relate?
I don't want to get kind of all over the place, but clearly what I'm trying to argue is that the diaspora is a moment of transformation, where instead of us guilt-tripping the diaspora by saying, there was a moment in the 60s and 70s exactly when the US opened up the flow of skilled immigrants to say that it's a brain drain. We educated you in our IITs, in our medical schools, and you have fled. Some of you still hear that, right? We gave you, so that from that to now, stay there but come back to us. And it is at those moments of spectacular visibility, mediated visibility, that I find that nationalism becomes the sort of bedrock, the sort of way, the nationalism and the nation become, as I call it, becomes a lone star. You can go away, but come back here. So I think what is interesting is not so much to stipulate particular moments when the nation outbeats other arguments, but to see how under conditions of neoliberal globalization and technological connectivity, a particular type of loyalty seems to be sunk. So, convinced. Okay, yeah.
This is completely unconnected to anything else we talked about.
That's fine.
So, you mentioned how there was very mild protest by the domestic workers, and there was a union.
Yeah.
And what I was wondering was, there's this whole media hyperbole and all that, but there's an everyday life that's continuing for the domestic workers, their reality, and how are their identities or their struggle with being a diaspora, and the fact that their diasporic experience is not really represented in the mainstream, how is that affected? And I guess you work with them, and this is more my personal curiosity, as in how are they negotiating their everyday life after something like this? Do they even feel connected to this kind of, media?
Yes, of course. First of all, you should realize that Kopradari herself, although she has a personal story of being married to an Indian American and so on, she is part of the diplomatic corps, right? So technically, to call her diasporic itself is a little problem. Secondly, I think these cases are always so invisible, the cases of domestic labor. It makes me think of, I don't know how many of you might have heard of the rape that took place with Dominic Strauss-Kahn and the IMF, and this woman from Guinea who actually came forth. Once again at that point, the reason why that came to mind is, of course, I've written about it, but also because women's groups protested, unions protested at that time. Very, very small. They even protested outside the IMF. And the thing was, the whole thing shifted to, is she a credible victim or not? Right? So whether what is their idea of their diasporic life and identity becomes not even an issue. And it's very small groups, unions and immigrant rights groups, which are seldom heard, are the ones who are, in a sense, voicing and backing their demands.
I'm actually asking, what is it that is their imagination of themselves? Because I know it's not voice. And I'm sort of curious, what is this voice?
I think, in this case, one heard precious little from Sangeeta Richards, except now, I think there was an interview which I kind of dug up where her husband speaks about her oppression and so on and so forth. But I can talk to you about the other case, where, in fact, she was very vocal. And she talks, in the Sofitel case, where she talks about being an immigrant and not being an immigrant, running away and seeking asylum because she was raped and so on and so forth. And that's a very interesting point there, because she, Ravi used the term biography, she stages a whole performance of her biography, which the media immediately found loopholes and said that we tracked it, she was not oppressed, she was not raped in her home country, she actually lied, and so on and so forth. But when you're under these extreme situations of duress, I have worked with domestic violence in the diaspora, there is in fact a great deal of what we might call, what the state might call fabrication in that desperation to gain favor. So that was the case. So ultimately she was not a worthy victim. And so the case was dropped because there were just too many other loopholes. So that again goes back to your question of the intersectionality of who constitutes a worthy victim, and and what aspect of her caste or class does she foreground. So thanks for that. Yeah, there's very little about Sangeeta except the latest one. It seems to be the timing of the Kopradari interview as well, which is soon after that. Yes. Is there anybody else on this side? Yeah, maybe go ahead.
As you were talking about the worthy victim, I was also thinking one of the problems that we all face is how to analyze this new narrative of nationalism without falling into the always rubrics of right-wing, neoliberal, what have you. And as we were talking about, that Rajratnam, McKinsey, all of these guys, and Kopradari, One thing that came to mind was, of course, what Povinelli calls the coming of recognition itself. What are the frameworks within which certain people become visible? But also, I was thinking the narrative of infiltration. Like, not that there's a lodestone and people come back to this, but sort of like sticking it to the big American imperialist project, where even the person that was really popular in Bombay at a particular time was Harshad Mehta. Like, the posters all over the place, he was a local hero. So they might have sort of done insider trading and all of these things. But look how they got away within this grand Western game kind of thing. And therefore the recognition also centers on this masculinity narrative of send out our spies in a post-Cold War era.
Yeah, and it fits right into, I've been looking at these school textbooks recently in relation to my own work. And gone are the days when it was Gandhi and Vivekananda. You know, Vivekananda, yes, he's coming back as a sort of symbolic Modi hero. But it's now Ambani. These are the heroes are all economic success stories, right? Or scion, the economic families and so on. So it fits right into that neoliberal narrative of, you know, these guys made it, they're rolling in wealth. It's that, you know, Rajaratnam had this, not just one penthouse, but multiple penthouses. So it's that, not just the dream, but the scale of that success, you know, I think is also a hyper-masculinist Wall Street phallic story, you know, so, yeah. Did I see another hand? Yes.
So my question connects two of the questions about. I just have a, basically, is it ever okay to shift loyalties to the host country on the part of the citizen, on the part of the diaspora? The individual, is it ever okay for the person to shift loyalties from the home country to the host country? And if so, in what context is it okay? For instance, Preet, obviously, he was criticized for shifting allegiances, or what was known as, what is called a shift of allegiance. Whereas Naipaul, for instance, was always a Trinidadian. He could criticize India and it was still okay. And on the reverse side of this, when is it okay for the homeland to reject the loyalty of the people abroad, which connects to, say, Harshad Mehta, these people? They are a representation of global India, as Modi calls it. But to what extent can they go before the homeland cuts off support? And what determines
I mean, this, I think, essentially was the quest in this paper. Saying that, you know, when certain administrative and affective inclinations of the diaspora run counter to nationalism at that particular point, then it becomes questionable. And is it okay? I don't know. That is the question. Is the question,
will it ever be accepted by the media or by...
A very legitimate question that you ask. I don't find flaws in your question. But I'm saying that maybe the meta question is not perhaps, is it okay? Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, that's the first thing that comes to all our minds. You know, when can, for example, during wartime, the diaspora is always asked, you know, in fact, there's some very interesting Indian American plays that were written about an older generation who would question America's involvement in Afghanistan, but the second generation who would unquestionably, you know, so once again, this sort of, how are you so easily shift the lines? It's a really amazing play called
Bobby. My own younger cousin who wants to join the US Navy.
Right. And then a father who, in this particular play, comes to my mind because the father who was in the, on left politics in his college days in the 60s, saying, all my life I was against US exceptionalism, you know, and then I had go to this crazy IIT journey, PhD, and I come here and look what I produced, you know. So this idea of when is it okay is the existential question. I don't know if it's an absolute question, it's the existential question that drives the diasporic sensibility. Thanks for that. Yes, Rose.
Summarize in her second part what I wanted to ask.
Go ahead, ask.
I think you hinted at it in parts, and I suspect that it may relate to what Professor Martin said earlier. if one were to look at the reverse aspect of it, about when the homeland chooses to affiliate itself with its diaspora and when not, and how this is a strategic process in itself, and what kind of, say, issues or cases lend themselves to this sort of affiliation. Because there was the sexual assault by an Indian fashion designer in New York, which didn't receive the same kind of...
I remember that story. Somebody told me about that. Yeah.
Or even more recently in Australia, where an Indian was convicted of harassment and so on in India, just completely washed hands.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are certain things that are...
In that case, wasn't there a movement or something to it?
It's the fashion designer? This was a New York fashion designer, somebody, right?
Slew of people. I mean, there were...
Yeah.
But I think there was a more, I don't know if the movement aid the fashion designer was as widespread or as based on the idea of nationality as it was the humanity of this is my brother who is being unjustly prosecuted.
So we also have the narrative of, वो America जाके American बनता है, if we see somebody speaking in an accent, we say American fake accent. So we Indians, we do not accept them. We see them as American, fake and all that. We don't accept them.
I mean, there was stuff about Greek for God's sake, if he's speaking in my head. So, that is a whole question of the aura of authenticity. That becomes a part of the nationalist narrative, which connects all your questions. And there's always certain problematic things, like, since we all brought up the domestic violence so much, those are issues which are always redundant, the left-leaning activist groups, groups like Sauda, for example, Saki, and so on, Manavi. These are groups that work with sexuality, with domestic violence and so on, are seedy side of diaspora life that nobody wants to acknowledge. But, the Venkateshwara temple and so on are the ones to be proud of, because we brought the stupa all the way from wherever, So, to your question, these are certain things that there's a seamless sort of logic of nationalism, a celebratory logic, which is what the diaspora is expected to prop. And the diaspora also, due to their insistence on this tradition and purity, enable that propping as well. So, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Professor. It was amazing how you braided together scholarship and everyday life and events in your session. Thank you for that very compelling perspectives on mobility, migration, and diaspora brought forth through the entire Kaubagadev, Modi, and Bharara narrative. So I call upon Yashaswini to present you with a little memento as a token of our gratitude. On behalf of the conference team, I thank our professors, speakers of the conference who have taken time off their schedules to be here and who have put forth valuable inputs to this session. Thank you, professors. Thank you, speakers. Finally, I thank all the participants of the session, folks from IIT, students from other institutes. Thank you for making a very lucid and interactive session possible. Thank you.
I went to the English department of the university and I saw this poster and I said, my God, this is just up my alley. I wish I could speak at this, And I let it go. And then somebody, your colleague, your classmate called me and here I am. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.